everyone, and I'm just going to start and then hand over the mic to Mary. I'm going to talk about a study that we worked on for a couple of years. It was part of a larger project precisely on social enterprise, which you just brought up, looking at what is the role of the social economy in scaling up local and sustainable food systems. And we focused particularly on trying to understand what is a farmer's market and what is the role of the farmer's market in that regional food system and in that social economy. This was part of a project that was a larger project in the social economy. Stuart Wolf here was the coordinator and is still the coordinator of that project, which is quite an initiative. The purpose of the project as a whole was to strengthen our ideas about what is a social enterprise, what is the social economy, how does that fit with the business model, and how do we actually leverage some of these organizations like farmers markets, which aren't technically businesses in a traditional sense, but actually actively facilitate business. They actually facilitate local economic development. They facilitate the access of individual farm businesses to a consumer market. So this was very much a community-led research project. It involved 15 different stakeholder organizations, 9 universities, a lot of research partners, a lot of students. So this really fits into that larger picture. So we chose farmers markets. We looked at CSAs and different elements of that sort of farm gate sales. And we chose farmers markets because they are precisely that interface as a social enterprise. They're often organized as nonprofits, so the farmers market itself is a nonprofit organization, which leads to some of the conceptual difficulties in pursuing business practice and sort of business model strategies. And we found, like David, that that's actually a limiting factor for the scaling up of the role of farmers markets in sustainable food systems. So conceptually, how do you get around being a nonprofit while facilitating profit for the farmers who actually need that space to survive as a vendor? So looking at farmers markets as business incubators, as mobilizing knowledge, as transferring technology, creating a link between the urban and the rural was a really important piece of that, looking at that relationship. And then also looking at what are the environmental implications. That actually ended up playing a smaller role in our study. There's several studies out there that actually do look at the sort of environmental footprint of farmers markets. So I'd encourage you to look those up. Our sort of final approach was to try to understand what are the obstacles and opportunities facing farmers markets. Where do we go from here? We've experienced this growth in numbers. We've experienced an increase in access. We've certainly experienced an increase in demand. And we found, particularly in the BC and Alberta case, bumping up the ceiling of supply, that we actually didn't have enough supply to feed this growing demand. And that's sort of the tension that we're looking at in this project. So just a brief word on our methodology. We first did what's called a Delphi study, which is an expert forecasting method. We interviewed some vendors, we interviewed some market managers, and we interviewed some agricultural policy people, like Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, people who are actually influencing policy around local food systems. We on purpose didn't interview consumers. We knew that research is being done extremely well by this group. So we see these projects as really complementary, trying to understand the different drivers and different actors in this food system and what do they think. We followed that up with a survey and semi-structured interviews in 61 markets. 61 interviews in 28 markets from 4 regional clusters. 2 clusters in Alberta and 2 clusters in BC. And the clustering of farmers markets, which Mary will talk about in a little bit, was one of the bigger findings of our study. Markets that are clustered, which enable farmers to attend more than one market, actually is a significant contribution to their ability to scale up their local food production and local food vending to regional communities. So at the time that we did the study, already we've seen there's a lot more markets. There was 102 registered farmers markets in BC and 105 in Alberta. Now this is an interesting finding. There are quite a few markets that weren't registered. So this got into the question of what is an authentic market. This is also a big thing that came up, especially in the interviews, that particularly market managers had very strong ideas about what was an authentic farmers market, what was an authentic thing to be selling. And this was actually a contested concept. Some vendors had other ideas. They wanted to come from farther away. Some markets wanted to do reselling because they didn't have enough supply to meet their customers' demands. And so this tension on how do we have enough supply to enable consumers to come and also maintain that authentic connection between the producer and the consumer. And this is one of the issues we want to put on the table for discussion. How do we get around this? This maintaining this authenticity without, requiring a farmer who's a single farmer who can't spend 4 days a week going to markets. How do you actually get around that? That's one of the discussion things. We found there was a lot of regional differences between farmers markets in Alberta and BC. Much more diverse range of products being grown and sold in BC. Farms were smaller in BC. There's more markets in Alberta. Markets were larger in BC. There was differences in levels of consumer awareness and economic capacity. This is from the perspective of the market managers and the vendors. Different levels of government support and control. So BC has pretty low government support for things like farmers markets that we found that was a little bit higher in Alberta, although certainly could be improved in that regard. Different are roles of the association. So conversely in BC, where we have very low government support, we have a very strong BC Farmers Market Association. Also, there was different regional differences in the ways in which farmers market connected with other community economic development and social economy organizations. So bringing it around to seeing the farmers market as an incubator, as a connector and a facilitator of local economic development. How does the farmers market see itself in that regard? Is it just something to provide that experience of celebration of local food, or are there actually direct policy and sort of institutional connections to other economic development organizations? So there's two studies, and again, I'm happy to pass around a sheet and email any of you the publications that we've developed in this. We have two studies that have been published that basically explore these things in great detail. This is a table from one of them. We interviewed in the Delphi, we had an open-ended question where we asked market managers, vendors, and policymakers, what is the local food system? And we found, and they all knew this was a farmers market study, and not all of them included farmers markets as an element of the local food system. That was a very interesting finding. Chain grocery stores were mentioned as many times as farmers markets. Specialty food retailers, restaurants, wholesalers. So you can see that the farmers market really is nestled within a very complex and diverse system of food distribution. How does it manage its space in that when it has different goals? Most of these organizations have different goals. Chain grocery stores have a goal of business profit, right? Specialty food retailers are selling a particular kind of experience, somewhat similar to farmers markets. Restaurateurs, everyone has a different goal here. How can a farmers market actually facilitate getting local food into these different venues through its social enterprise? We also found, as I said, one of the main barriers to farmers markets increasing the role of the local food system was this constraint on supply. And we developed through the interview process a ranked list of what were the biggest barriers to increasing the supply of local food. It's funny, you think of farmers market and you think high prices, particularly in BC. Low prices was the number one constraint to increasing the supply of local food. This is low prices from the perspective of the vendors, who are facing extremely high labor costs, high input costs, and high transportation costs, especially when they're driving, 800 kilometers. Sorry, I gave away my miraculous. 800 kilometers round trip to sell at a market. So low prices, lack of access to labor, and interestingly, we heard Jose this morning talking about the migrant farm worker program. Very few of these vendors who sell at farmers markets employ migrant labor. They have ethical and sort of usually reasons why they're not participating in that kind of labor practice, but at the same time, they can't find people to work on their farms. Many of them rely on unpaid apprentices, which is a different kind of exploitation, which I'm sure you could tell us about, but this is a problem. How do you actually pay people a living wage and then sell your product at a price that people can afford to buy it? A limited local processing capacity. I have another student right now doing a study on the processing sector in BC, which has been devastated by NAFTA and the moving of processing facilities down to the United States and to Mexico. Underdeveloped marketing options. That was an interesting one. We think of farmers markets as the new marketing option, right? This is our fresh and fastest growing way of getting food to consumers, but at the same time, as we saw on David's slide, it's a very tiny portion of the food distribution network. So what are the additional marketing options that could build on or leverage from a farmer's market to actually get more food into the system? Lack of marketing expertise. Many farmers state that is their highest problem, that they don't know how to market this kind of food, so they rely on a farmer's market to do that for them. How do we deal with that? So R2 and R3, we did 2 rounds of the study. We did an open-ended round where we asked people to suggest what are the biggest constraints to increasing the supply of local food. We analyzed those data and sort of listed them all, and then asked in the second round for people to rank them. So, some people,
the difference.
Yes,
they changed their mind after.
They changed their mind. Well, also that, for example, those last 3 didn't appear in the first set of questions that we asked. They came out as a result of those questions, so then they were added to the second round. So it's a matter of not just sort of taking a one-off snapshot of people's opinions, actually a directed conversation over a period of time to see how people see this moving forward. So those are just a list of the many constraints to increasing the supply of local food in an alternative and sustainable food system. So our main conclusions in this part of this first round of that study was that there are extreme tensions between what we're calling the boundaries of authenticity and the ability of a farmer's market to scale up a local food system. That's a constraint that is unresolved. How do you maintain those relationships, that social experience, while also increasing supply, increasing access of local food to consumers, and getting producers able to actually make a living from that? What do we need to enhance local food systems? Farmers markets are one option. We had a lot of discussion in this study about things like food hubs, local food distribution networks, cooperative marketing. How do you actually enable those different kinds of local food marketing while maintaining that farmer to consumer relationship and what they call authenticity? Some responses from the people that we worked with were things like local and regional branding. For example, we've had off and on in BC a BC program. It's generally been oriented towards the larger producers, and Save on Foods is the biggest sort of, that's where you see BC in these large scale supermarkets. Improved coordination, that was a big one that came out, is that the BC Association of Farmers Markets has a very good network of coordination. How do they link with other entities? Improved infrastructure, this gets into the idea of the food hub. What kinds of physical infrastructure, like a warehouse, do we have for local food? We don't actually have that in BC. Starting to have some of those initiatives in Alberta. Everyone wanted changes in government policy at all levels. So what kinds of policies? How do we coalesce around certain kinds of demands or certain kinds of requests to government to enable this kind of food system that we want? And using data like the multipliers is one way to get policymakers to listen to these kind of suggestions from farmers and market managers. Preserving farmers and farmland. That was a really big one that came out of, especially the BC participants in this study, that we actually have really good farmland in BC, a lot of which is being paved right over, and nearest our biggest market. So how do we actually leverage something like a farmer's market or a local food distribution system to protect farmland and get new farmers onto that farmland? And then finally, well, we already mentioned developing more local processing facilities to add value. These are still, most of these markets are selling fresh foods, a little bit of dairy, a little bit of meat, very little processed food is going through these markets, and we have a lot of open space and open potential to do processing, but we lack a lot of facilities, and a lot of that has to do with things like food safety regulations. So how do you navigate those institutional difficulties? I think we're done here, but I need to pass it over to Mary, who's going to talk about the second portion of the study, where we did the Delphi, and then we went off and did the individual interviews about the market clusters.
Okay, so the
the second part of our study was kind of serendipitous. We were actually going to do some case studies. That was kind of the second stage after the Delphi. We thought we'd just look at some markets that were really successful and do some case studies on them. So we pulled up the maps of the farmers markets from both the associations from BC and Alberta. And I distinctly remember sitting there. It was in the SFU Harbourfront building. And we brought these maps that we were looking at. And we thought, well, like it's kind of, well, first of all, we didn't know where to start. And then we started seeing these clumps of markets appearing in certain regions. And I mean, we just thought, well, what's going on there? What is this? And luckily, Paul Sabai, who was there, he said, oh, those are clusters. And we said, clusters? Oh, okay, what's that? So none of us were really economists, except he has a bit of an economist bent. So anyhow, we sort of opened up this whole nut around clustering, which proved to be quite interesting. So we picked 2 clusters from each province. One, as you can see, in metropolitan areas and one in rural areas. And in Vancouver, the reason we picked these, well, because like I said, they were clusters. We wanted one rural, one metropolitan. And also we wanted markets that were within a tight geographic location, and we picked a 100-kilometer radius. So each of those areas then had that. And just to give you some numbers there. Okay, so in Metro Vancouver at that time, there were 18 markets, and we studied 9 of them. On South Vancouver Island, there's 17, and that's from a kind of a large area on South Vancouver Island. There were 17 markets, and we studied 7 of them. Edmonton area, 12 markets, we studied 7. Central Alberta, 12 markets, we studied 5. So, okay, well, so clustering, like I said, we didn't really know what clustering meant until we got into the literature. It's defined as a geographically proximate group of interconnected companies and institutions in a particular field, linked by commonalities and complementarities. It's characterized by knowledge mobilization, competitive and collaborative forces. So there's a whole body of clustering literature in economic literature. It's also in, find it in geography, and it's, mostly been studied in the for-profit sector, especially industrial development and manufacturing, the high-tech sector. Silicon Valley is a prime example of one of those. Also, retail clustering is another aspect of that's been studied quite well. And why clustering happens is because of what they call locational antecedents. So in other words, you need certain factors for a cluster to happen. And these can be, like I said, it can be in all sorts of fields, whether it's industrial development, retail, marketing, whatever, other sorts of marketing. So these are some of the locational antecedents. Biophysical infrastructure, so in other words, for farmers markets, that means you have to have a production base, in other words, for a supply. Knowledgeable and skilled labor force, common goals, access to demanding consumers, community support, and institutional support. And those are gathered from a number of different kinds of studies. So the other thing that clustering is characterized by is, well, there's co-location, but then, and you can get retail and restaurants, let's say, that are co-located, but they don't necessarily interact at all, but just by being in a certain location together, they're benefiting from that. That draws more consumers to that area. But to move from co-location to active clustering is a bit of a different story. And we found that in these areas, that these regions that we were studying, that there was a movement from co-location to active clustering, which meant that there was horizontal and vertical relations, knowledge mobilization, collaborative and competitive forces. And as a result of that, that there's innovative responses emerging out of those clusters to these challenges of scale, scope, infrastructure, and organizational capacity that are really characteristic of alternative food networks in general. So, we looked at it. We looked at these relationships, these collaborations, both in horizontal and vertical formation, and also within that we looked at informal and formal relations under those. But anyhow, I won't get into that kind of detail. So yeah, in terms of horizontal knowledge mobilization is key for active clustering. And what we found was that that the movement of vendors and the classification, the general classification of vendors that we found were sort of key to knowledge mobilization. And we found three broad categories of vendors. There's the retired seniors. I'm sure you've all seen them with their knitted toques and mitts, selling things like where they're there to make some money, but it's also a hobby and a way for them to get out. The second category would be individual and single-family operations, and the seniors tend to stay in one market. They don't usually do a bunch of markets. The individual or family operations will often hire external help, not always, but often, and they will sometimes move around between 2 to 3 markets per week, let's say. And then the third category are the vendor partnerships, and these are the large operations that you see in Alberta, the Innisfail growers, the pick and packs. In BC, it's the sandwich growers and Island Food Services Co-op. They're the ones that they fall into the category sometimes of corporate. In the corporate category, in Alberta, we have an 80-20 rule here, that 80% of the vendors should be, you make it, bake it, grow it vendors, whereas 20% are the larger scale commercial or operations. Sometimes Hutterites fall into that category, but anyhow, there's these partnerships. And that enables them, because they have pooled their labor and their resources, they're able to, what we call, pollinate a number of markets. And we actually, I think Innisfail growers markets 13 different markets a week. So they move around not only within their particular cluster, but they move between clusters as well. So they move pretty much market all the way from central Alberta down all the way to southern Alberta. So there's movement of vendors, there's movement of products, customers, and capital within and between these clusters. Another thing that we noticed was the development of market circuits in these clusters. The market managers will get together and formally arrange the days and times of their markets so that there's not a competition between them, so that the customers can move around and so the vendors can move around as well. So these market circuits are really quite an enabling feature that's kind of evolved. There's also sharing of information informally between vendors. You know, they're sharing their growing tips, they're sharing their marketing tips, and market managers also will have informal discussions with their vendors as well as with other market managers. There's some other formal entities, like in BC, there's the market societies. There's your local farmers market society and artisanal farmers market society, which have a number of markets that operate. They're the umbrella organization that oversees the development and support for these markets. So that's kind of a very important entity. And then of course there's market associations as well. And as I said, there's these collaborative partnerships and cooperatives forming. And the Innisfail growers, for example, how they developed, they started off by they were individual families that marketed at farmers markets, and they got together. There were 5 of these families that got together and formed Innisfail growers, and that's how they were then able to scale up by moving around to different markets. But they also distribute market in many other options as well, through other options as well. And then, of course, there's the vendor-client relation. So there's a lot of relationships that happen at farmers markets, a quite complex set of horizontal relationships. So there's, you know, like I said, there's all these are ways for addressing the challenges of scale and scope and organization capacity. And then there's also vertical relationships, mutually beneficial relationships with surrounding businesses. Like, for example, the Rimbey market, somebody was mentioning Rimbey.
One of the best.
Love that market.
It's unreal.
Yeah, it is. In fact,
they're all different.
yeah, these are all from.
I'm noticing, like, oh, they're all from Rimbey.
Yeah, I really love that market too. Anyhow, they have some interesting relationship, at least at that time. They had, they were doing procurement to the seniors lodge there, I think. They were, yeah, some of the fruits and vegetables, some of the vendors were selling into the lodge. They also, a lot of farmers markets have a table always free for community organizations, for NGOs to come and talk about what they're doing out in the community. As I mentioned earlier, municipal governments usually have a very strong relationship with markets because they allow them, or they have some kind of arrangement with infrastructure or leasing agreements. Post-secondary institutions like us from the university obviously have had a relationship also with them. So there's lots of different horizontal and vertical collaborations. There also are competitive forces that drive innovation. And David, you're right, like there's a lot of competition going on between newly starting up markets and more established markets for vendors. Also to get that kind of a mix of vendors that makes a good market, that you, and some of those vendors are so hard to get, right? Like some of the dairy and meat, depending on where you are. But anyhow, the best markets are those typically that have a nice, diverse offering of products. So our conclusions on this was that there's definitely need for further research to look at the factors that limit and enable market cluster formation and the mechanisms and trajectory of development in other locations as well. Cluster research really there hasn't been very much done on the social economy at all. There hasn't been very much done either on retail or local food. So I think it's an interesting way for a social mechanism. You know, it's a soft mechanism to actually build momentum and scale. So it's not like a food hub where you actually need that physical building to coalesce people. It's an actual social infrastructure that's kind of evolved spontaneously, well, because of those locational antecedents that then can help this scaling up and out. Like I said, it's still relatively unexplored, and there's an opportunity, I think, to look at this, and especially to draw the social economy actors and the public sector and the private sector together to use this as a strategy to move forward. So the notion of clustering. But yeah, as I said, and the very last one there, relocalizing food is giving rise to different strategies in different contexts. I mean, if you go to Europe, it's quite a different story. Farmers markets aren't as big there, but CSAs, box schemes are really big. So it's very different in different parts of the world. But it does seem that social values and relationships is what this movement is about. And that's what the social economy is about. And I think that's why farmers markets are social economy agents and why they play such a critical role. I mean, I think developing a business case, a stronger business case in many ways is important, but I think we don't want to lose that social value of farmers markets. And those are the two papers that came out of our study.